Thank you so much. I appreciate both of your contributions, Eduardo and Farina. I think it's really great that there are expansions on some of these ideas. There are deeper dives. I've read their papers, and there's a lot more that they haven't covered, touched on. So you guys just kind of got like the skinny on it. But, you know, I kind of went maybe deeper than I should have. But yeah, just really, first of all, I appreciate that you guys are doing this work and that we're here in this conference and that there are a variety and diverse approaches, ideas, concepts, backgrounds, languages informing the kind of things that we're talking about. And that's why we're here, is because it's really important for us to get both good feedback and feedback that might challenge a little bit of what we've, the positions we've taken. And so I just wanted to kind of say that first, because I think starting with Eduardo's stuff, I kind of am not really sure why I'm the respondent right here. Like I come from like a filmmaker, scholar, activist background, and I'm doing a lot of work with like land protection. But, the more I read into both of your papers, the more I realized, well, then my difference is my strength. And the thing that I'm contributing is another perspective, right? And so my work has to do a lot with issues of representation, about ways that we are portraying ourselves, performing indigeneity, performing scholarship, performing history, music, narratives, art, finding all these ways that we can have the tie-ins that might make our work a little bit more interesting, dynamic, or stronger. So, I was thinking about Eduardo's kind of positionality, and that a lot of us, we've kind of fixated our reflexivity in places that kind of say that who we are and where we're from is informing the way that we're kind of portraying, our work. And I think it's looking at the line of logic that you're going with. It's great because, you can see it, you can imagine it, you can break it down. And I love how you did the visual parts of that, because that helps me tremendously as a filmmaker, as a visual guy. That people don't always think textually or within a scripture setting or dogmatically in the way that we've been trained in these kind of academic, scholarly, and even church-like spaces. So that helps whoever your position is. And so kind of thinking about that, if we were to say who our audience was, where would you say that your positionality as the author lies on this matrix, right? Or are we saying specifically that you are taking a purely, as much as possible, objective look and view on this? But I think, it helps a lot for us to kind of understand that if we're kind of taking it through different story dynamics and breaking it apart as like almost like a history lesson, because you're saying like the social political kind of back and forth of these groups. I think they are reflective of the time in a lot of ways. And I think some of our colleagues here, their work also reflects that as well, with Elise Boxer and Thomas Murphy. We're talking about like the colonial influences of the time, of the authors, Joseph Smith in particular. We're thinking about the 1830s and all the other impacts of little pockets of indigenous folks interacting with settler colonials, and even ideas of resistances and resurgences of their own spirituality merged with different Christian traditions, right? So to say that that is not true is incorrect. It is true, but when we're talking about a linear, real reading of history, are we talking about it as something that is separate and apart from you, or separate and apart from history as more as like a metaphorical piece? Or is it more of like, we're talking about a reflection of the time, just interpreted through the Book of Mormon? There's a lot of different angles you could take there. But I find that all of them would be really interesting, especially in dialogue in relation to other folks' work. Because I thought about the ways that you were talking about, the back and forth between the ways that their motivations are driven by their perceptions of each other. And that's obviously, that's also speaking of the time, right? Like we're coming out of the period of the Enlightenment, we're getting closer and closer to locking up the West, and they're about to converge onto the Civil War era of the 1860s, in which slavery is still an attempt to be justified enough that thousands of white folks are willing to kill and die for it. And so you're already talking about these kind of like hierarchies of race and power, right? So those dynamics play into it. I don't wax prolific too long on this. I'm already at half. Okay, so I want to stay close and clean to transferring over to Farina's. But Farina also has really great stuff. And I think here's where an interesting convergence happens, is because if they wanted to go the route in which they're talking specifically about issues of representation and performance, there's a lot of literature out there that way that can really feed into it. So if you're thinking about like Dressing in Feathers, or even Michelle Rahija's reservation realism, because then we're talking about visual sovereignty, narrative sovereignty, like all these representations of like, what does that mean to be sovereign, independent, autonomous in our own self-representations, rather than having someone else represent us, which I think was what you were pointing at in your earlier other version of your paper, is that it was like Nephites telling the Lamanite story, right? So it's like an outsider kind of telling who we are versus our own identity and our own stories. And then so I also saw kind of another convergence happening with the way that when we're talking about these resistances, I love the way that you kind of are placing some of that stuff in there with, you know, Tribes of Many Feathers and AIM, and just like the simultaneous like cropping up of little like resistance native groups that were in conjunction with the existence of the Lamanite generation. And so that was a thing that popped up for me continually, was lineage, because you kept saying about like the generations of this group, that it was no longer Lamanite generation, but it was coming into living legends. And then you had these other groups like Tribe of Many Feathers, and then they were becoming their own things. And so you started with that, even with the clan, right? Right? So you say, even from the Neh perspective, what our lineage is, our clan, our affiliations, and that it's so old that it couldn't be interpreted or understood in any of these Western frameworks anyway, because it's talking about plants, animals, relatives. The place that we're literally from is our traditional land acknowledgement. We don't have to say we acknowledge, we say that when we're doing our introduction, right? Because that's our relationship. That's why land acknowledgements are empty when people just perform them, because they don't have a relationship, but we do. And so using that vehicle of lineage, like you could say, these are my lines, and then build on that would be super powerful. Also saying about the lineage part for your representation, I think, where did I put that? Billion notes here, guys. She did. It's huge. Yeah, it's. I was doing some work. So there's a little bit more that can be said on the performance pieces, and I'll just say these two because I'm running out of time. The one is that, you know, there's a history of Native folks that are performing for survival, for collective identity, for visibility and voice being heard, being represented. And it didn't matter what form it took, as long as that they were putting themselves out there, right? So there's a lot of that, like we're thinking about like early formations of powwows that kind of started to collect pan-Indianist traditions, or Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, right? Where it's like, this is like a vestige of that. Lamanite generation is like Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where they're going around and they're saying, this is who we are. And of course, it's not 100% authentic, but we're alive and we're here. Like, pay attention to us, you know? And so that's like a way to survive. And then the other piece was, there's definitely a little bit more of what can be said with the Miss Indian pageant, because the BYU. Yeah, the whole thing. There's a whole documentary about that with Miss Navajo Nation, and how like it's different than any other beauty pageant because they highlight and prioritize cultural values. Right, right. Not in the kind of like classic Euro-American Western way of a pageant, right? Like, but there is ways that you can kind of prioritize what kind of values that, you know, your culture is holding, especially when it comes to these pageants for Native women. And I think that's really interesting and valuable because it's super informative of like what direction that performance is going to go. Because you said they just restarted it back up again, right? Yeah. Yeah. So those are past and present kind of performance thing. That's a lot of stuff in here, but thank you so much. I really appreciate reading your work, and I encourage both of you to keep going. It's good stuff.